I wondered if Leonard loved me. The dome gave me my answer.
People asked if she was all right. She said yes, standing in the church parking lot, November air cold against her face, a neighbor's casserole still warm in her hands. That was the only lie she ever told in 12 years of marriage, because Leonard never once said he loved her. Not once. And she had carried that question, quietly, alone, right up until the day he died. After that, his son showed up with a lawyer, ready to take everything that was left, until the day she opened an old rusted lock on a steel door, a dome nobody wanted, on land nobody cared about, and understood that Leonard had been telling her all along. He just said it the only way he knew how. Leonard Dean never wasted a word. In 34 years on Earth before Margot, and 12 years beside her, he had learned that most things worth saying could be done without saying anything at all. She thought about that now, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. 3 weeks since the funeral. The yard looked the same. The tools hanging in the same order on the same hooks along the workshop wall. The old blue truck still parked where he always parked it, slightly crooked. Driver's side closer to the fence. Everything the same, except the man who arranged it that way wasn't coming back. The last morning he was home, Leonard was up before 5:30. Margot heard him from the bedroom, the slow drag of the kitchen chair, the particular sound the old percolator made when the heat clicked on. She lay still and listened. She had spent 12 years learning his sounds the way you learn a house. Which step creaked, which door stuck in winter, which silences meant he was thinking, and which meant he was done. She got up and stood in the doorway. He was sitting at the table with his coffee, both hands wrapped around the mug. His right hand had a slight tremor. It had been there for over a year now, the Parkinson working its slow way through him. He didn't talk about it. Neither did she. That was another thing they had learned together. Some things didn't need naming to be real. He was looking out the window toward the far end of the property where the tree line broke and the old dirt road curved out of sight. She thought he was watching the sky. Montana skies in early October could hold your attention. That particular gray-blue before the light fully arrived. The kind that made the mountains look like they'd been cut from paper. She watched him for a long time. He never looked back. She went back to bed without saying anything. She didn't know then that it was the last morning she would have the choice. 12 years of marriage, and she could map most of it through objects rather than words. The welding gloves he hung on the same nail by the back door every single evening. Never the hook beside it, never the shelf below, always that one nail. She used to think it was stubbornness. Now she thought it might have been something closer to faith. A man who trusted that if you put things back in the same place, they'd be there when you needed them. The dried flower arrangement she'd set on the windowsill the second year they were married. Something her mother had made. Brown and brittle and long past its time. Leonard never asked about it. Never moved it. It sat in the same spot for 10 years. Collecting light and a thin layer of dust, and he cleaned around it every Saturday morning without comment. The small notebook she found once in his truck. Blue cover, spiral bound. She'd opened it thinking it was a parts list or a job estimate. Instead, a column of dates and times and doctors' names. All hers. Her follow-up appointments, her specialist visits, her prescription refill reminders. His handwriting, small and careful, every entry made before she had remembered to make it herself. She put the notebook back where she found it. She never told him she'd seen it. And the chair on the front porch, wood, simple, no cushion, that he built the first autumn they were together and set outside without ceremony or explanation. It was still there, still solid, the kind of work that didn't ask for credit. Once, only once in 12 years, she had asked him directly. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. She didn't plan it. The question just came out. "Leonard, do you ever regret this?" "Us?" He set his coffee cup down, looked out the window for a moment. Then, "No. Just that." No explanation, no follow-up. At the time, she thought it was too short an answer. Standing in the kitchen now, 3 weeks after they buried him, she wasn't so sure. She had met him at 43. He came into the community clinic on a Tuesday in late March, with his right hand wrapped in a shop rag, dark with grease and blood both. He set it on the intake desk without drama. "Metal fragment," he said, "from the welding torch." He'd driven himself 20 minutes from his property and walked in calm as a man arriving for a haircut. Margot cleaned the wound and put in 7 stitches. He didn't flinch once. They exchanged maybe 40 words in 20 minutes, all of them necessary. He came back 3 days later to have the stitches checked. Same quiet, same economy of movement. He didn't say thank you. He set a paper bag of apples on her desk and left before she could respond. She had always assumed, that last morning, that he was looking at the sky. Standing here now, she wasn't sure anymore, because she knew something she hadn't known then. 5 years before he got sick, Leonard had registered a piece of land in her name. A small dome-roofed structure at the end of Old Forge Road, rusted, unused, the kind of place most people drove past without seeing. He had paid for it himself, filed the paperwork himself, and never said a word about it. Not once in 12 years, which meant that when he sat at that table in the early morning dark, looking out toward the tree line, he wasn't watching the sky. He was looking at something he had already decided to give her. She just didn't know it yet. She had called Cole when Leonard went into the hospital the last time. A Wednesday evening. The nurse said it could be days. Cole picked up on the second ring. He was in the middle of a trial. A big one, he said. He'd come as soon as he could get away. He hadn't made it in time. She hadn't called him again after that. There hadn't been a reason to. The church held maybe 60 people. For a man who had lived in the same county for 30 years, that wasn't many. But Leonard had never been the kind of person who collected friends. He collected work. He collected debts owed and debts paid, and the respect that comes from doing what you say you'll do quietly, without making anyone acknowledge it. The people in those pews weren't there because Leonard had been warm. They were there because he had been reliable, and in a small Montana town. That counted for something close to love. Margot sat in the front row. Delia sat beside her. At some point during the service, Delia placed her hand over Margot's and left it there. She didn't squeeze, didn't say anything. Just the weight of it, steady and still. Margot kept her eyes on the casket. She didn't cry. Not because the grief wasn't there. It was there. She felt it when she lifted the coffee pot that morning and set it down too hard without meaning to. She felt it when she reached for her phone to call someone and stopped, because the person she would have called was Leonard. She didn't cry because Leonard would not have wanted that. Not here. Not in front of people who were watching, who would remember. He had lived his whole life without making anyone uncomfortable with his feelings. The least she could do was the same. The minister said the right things. He had known Leonard only a little, and it showed. The words were respectful, true in a general way. The kind of eulogy that fits any quiet man who died before his time. Margot listened to each sentence and thought, "That's accurate. That's accurate too. That one isn't quite right." Nobody else would have known the difference. Afterward, people came to her with food and careful faces and nothing useful to say, which didn't stop them from saying things. Margot thanked each of them. She accepted the casseroles and the pies and the handshakes. She stood straight the entire time. She drove home alone. Cole Dean did not come to his father's funeral. He had told her he'd come when he could get away. He hadn't gotten away in time. And now here he was, 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, in a dark suit that still smelled faintly of the city. Margot saw the car from the kitchen window. A rental, dark gray, the kind of anonymous vehicle you pick up at an airport. It sat at the curb for a moment before the door opened. Cole stepped out, straightened his jacket, and walked to the front door without hurrying. He didn't knock. He stood on the porch and waited. Margot set down her coffee and went to the door. She hadn't seen Cole in 4 years. He was 38 now, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the particular composure of a man who had been trained to keep his face from showing what he was thinking. He was good-looking in the way that made you trust him slightly less than you should. They looked at each other. He didn't say, "I'm sorry about Dad." She noticed that. "I need to talk to you about the estate," he said. She let him in. Made coffee. 2 cups, same as always. The automatic muscle memory of 12 years of a house with another person in it. Cole sat at the kitchen table and set his briefcase on the floor beside his chair. He didn't open it yet. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her the way lawyers look at people when they want to seem reasonable. He was calm, measured. That was the thing about Cole. He wasn't angry, not visibly, not in any way you could push back against. He simply explained. The will, he said, was problematic. His father had signed it 14 months before his death, after the Parkinson's diagnosis. The progression, the medication, the cognitive effects that could accompany that kind of neurological condition. There were grounds, he said, to question whether Leonard had been fully himself when he signed it. He wasn't saying his father had been incompetent. He was saying there were questions. Questions that a court might find worth examining. He reached into his briefcase and set an envelope on the table between them. "I'm prepared to offer you a settlement," he said. "The house for 6 months. That gives you time to make arrangements. And $50,000. You'd be comfortable." Margot looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a gust of wind moved through the cottonwood at the edge of the yard. The branches knocked lightly against the window frame, the same sound they'd made for 12 years. "Comfortable," she said. Cole waited for more. There was no more. He wasn't sure what to do with just the one word, so he kept going. The timeline, the legal process, the reasonableness of the offer compared to what litigation would cost both of them. His voice stayed even, professional. The voice of a man who had delivered difficult news before and learned to do it without flinching. Margot listened. She watched the way his hands stayed flat on the table when he talked, controlled, deliberate. She watched the small tension around his eyes when she didn't respond the way he expected. She had spent 15 years reading people's bodies in clinical rooms, learning what the face said when the mouth was saying something else. Cole Dean was not here about a will. He stood to leave, picked up his briefcase, walked to the door. Then he stopped. He turned back, and for just a moment, the composure slipped. Not much, only a fraction. The way a mask shifts when the person behind it forgets to hold it. And he said, "I'm not the bad guy here, Margot. I'm just the one who remembers what my father was before you came along." He said it quietly, almost gently, which made it worse. The door closed behind him. Margot stood at the window and watched his car back out of the driveway. She watched it move down the road and around the bend and disappear into the tree line. Then she went back to the kitchen and washed the 2 coffee cups, his and hers, and set them both upside down on the drying rack, the way Leonard had always done. She stood at the sink for a moment after that, hands still damp, looking at nothing in particular. The envelope was still on the table. She hadn't touched it. She left it there. Delia made the appointment without asking. She showed up the morning after Cole's visit with a container of soup and a name written on a folded piece of paper. Patricia Wren, estate attorney, 20 minutes north, off the highway. Leonard used her, Delia said, setting the soup on the counter. More than once. She called me after the funeral. Margot looked at the paper, then at Delia. She called you? She said she'd been expecting to hear from you. Delia picked up her keys. Appointments Thursday at 2. She was out the door before Margot could argue. Not that Margot had planned to argue. She had spent the night at the kitchen table going through what she actually owned, what was actually hers, running the numbers the way she used to run vitals, methodically, without panic, because panic had never helped a patient, and it wasn't going to help her now. The envelope Cole left was still on the table. She still hadn't touched it. She needed to know what she had before she decided what to do with what she didn't. Patricia Wren stood up when Margot walked in. Not the way people stand for strangers. The way people stand when they've been waiting. She was 52, compact and steady, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a desk that was organized in a way that suggested she knew exactly where everything was. The office was small, bookshelves along 2 walls, a window that looked out onto a parking lot, a philodendron on the sill that had been growing there long enough to reach the ceiling. The kind of office where work got done and nobody needed it to look impressive. "Mrs. Dean," Patricia said, "sit down. There's something Leonard wanted you to know." Margot sat. Patricia opened a folder on her desk. Thick, tabbed, the kind of file that represented more than one conversation. She didn't rush into it. She set her hands flat on the cover and looked at Margot directly. "Leonard came to see me 14 months ago," she said. "He knew Cole would fight the will. He'd known it for a long time, actually. He wanted to make sure that whatever happened in probate, you had something that couldn't be touched." Margot said nothing. She was listening the way she used to listen when a doctor gave a family difficult news, taking in every word, holding them still, not reacting until she had all of them. Patricia turned to the back of the folder. She slid a single page across the desk. Property transfer. 5 acres, Old Forge Road. 1 structure, metal frame, dome configuration. Transfer date, 5 years prior. Consideration paid, $8,500, cash. Grantee, Margot Dean. Not Margot and Leonard Dean. Not the Dean Family Trust. Not subject to the will or the estate or any proceeding Cole could initiate. Just her name, alone on the line. "He paid cash," Patricia said. "Your name only, not marital property. It was transferred as a direct gift, properly documented, before any of this." She paused. "Cole cannot touch it." Margot looked at the page for a long time. Her own name, typed in a legal document she had never seen, in an office she had never been to, arranged by a man who had never once mentioned it. Leonard had done this 5 years ago, without telling her, without asking for anything in return. She thought about the notebook in the truck, the dried flowers on the windowsill, the chair on the porch that was still solid after 12 winters. She thought about no. She looked up at Patricia. What's out there? I don't know, Patricia said. He never told me. He just made sure it was yours. They drove out after the appointment. Margot and Delia, in Delia's truck, because Margot's hands were steadier when someone else was driving. The road north ran flat for a while before it bent into the foothills, the mountains sitting pale and distant above the tree line. Delia didn't talk. That was one of the things Margot had always valued about her. She understood that some silences weren't meant to be filled. Old Forge Road was a dirt track, barely wide enough for one vehicle, running between walls of tall grass and scrub pine. The truck moved slowly. Margot watched the tree line and said nothing. The dome appeared around a curve without warning. It was larger than she expected. The structure rose from the clearing like something that had grown there. A long, curved form in rusted steel, the color of old blood where the metal had oxidized, darker where water had run and dried over years of seasons. Several of the corrugated panels along the roofline had lifted at the edges. Grass grew against the base on all sides. The two front doors, wide, heavy steel, set in a frame that had settled slightly into the ground, were secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist. Delia put the truck in park and looked at it. "You knew about this place?" she said. "I knew he had it," Margot said. "I didn't know what it was." She got out. The grass was wet from the morning and soaked her boots immediately. She walked to the doors and stood in front of the lock. Patricia had given her a single key, iron, black with age, heavier than it looked. Margot turned it over once in her palm. She thought of Cole at her kitchen table. The envelope. "You'd be comfortable." She put the key in the lock. It didn't turn. She applied more pressure. Nothing. She gripped the key with both hands and leaned into it. The lock gave. Not with a click, but with a low, reluctant sound, metal yielding to metal after years of stillness. The shackle swung loose. The chain fell against the door with a hollow clang. Margot stood with her hand still on the key. Behind her, Delia didn't say anything. The wind moved through the tall grass with a dry, papery sound. A magpie called once from somewhere in the pines and went quiet. 10 seconds, maybe more. Then Margot pulled the door open. It was heavy and it protested, hinges grinding, the bottom edge scraping across packed dirt. She got it wide enough to step through and held it there. The air that came out was cold and still and smelled like metal and old wood and something she couldn't name yet, something that felt, impossibly, like Leonard. She stood in the opening and looked into the dark. The letter from the court arrived on a Monday. Patricia had already called twice before Margot reached the mailbox. She stood at the end of the driveway and read the document once, straight through, the way she used to read intake reports, not looking for the good parts, just for what was actually there. The language was formal and precise and said, underneath all of it, one simple thing: Cole had filed. Patricia's third call came before she got back to the house. "He's contesting the will on grounds of testamentary incapacity," Patricia said. "The Parkinson's diagnosis, the timing of the signature, 14 months before Leonard died. Cole is arguing that the neurological condition affected Leonard's ability to make sound, legal decisions." Margot sat down at the kitchen table. "Can he argue that?" "He has a case, not a strong one, but enough." A pause. "Enough for what?" "Enough to cost you time and money you may not have." "There was a second claim," Patricia explained. "Some of the equipment in Leonard's old workshop. Welding tools, machinery, a hydraulic press. Cole was arguing they hadn't been specifically enumerated in the will, and therefore fell outside its provisions. It was a smaller claim, Patricia said, almost a footnote. But footnotes had a way of becoming complications. Margot wrote it all down. Biro on a legal pad, the same way she used to take notes during patient consultations. Dates, names, the specific language Patricia used. She didn't trust herself to remember everything correctly, and she had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous assumption in a difficult situation was that you already understood it. When Patricia finished, Margot thanked her and said she'd call back in the morning. She set the phone on the table and looked at what she'd written. The week that followed had a particular texture she hadn't expected. It wasn't the legal proceedings that wore at her. Those she could track, could organize, could respond to with the same methodical attention she'd given to everything else. It was the town. Cole had grown up here. His father had been Leonard Dean, whose name was on half the repaired equipment in the county. Cole had left for law school and built a career in Billings, but he still knew people, and people who knew him tended to give him the benefit of a doubt they didn't yet know how to extend to a woman who had moved here at 43 and never fully shed the quality of someone who came from somewhere else. She noticed it first at the hardware store. Ed Garrity, who had sold Leonard supplies for 20 years and always nodded to Margot when she came in with him, looked up when she entered and then looked back down at the counter without the nod. It lasted less than a second. She wasn't even certain she'd read it right. Then the Holloways across the road stopped waving from the porch in the mornings. Then Delia told her, carefully, what she'd been hearing at the store. "Someone said you weren't from here originally," Delia said. She was looking at the table when she said it, not at Margot, which told Margot everything about how Delia felt about repeating it. Margot was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I'm not. 12 years. She had held Leonard's hand through 4 of them, while his body turned against him. The tremor, the medication adjustments, the days he couldn't grip a wrench and sat in the workshop anyway, because sitting at home felt worse. She had driven him to appointments in Billings and waited in parking lots with bad coffee, and driven him home again without making it into something he needed to comment on. But she was not from here, as if that explained something. That night, she sat at the kitchen table until nearly 11. The legal paperwork spread in front of her. A cup of tea she'd forgotten about gone cold at her elbow. The overhead light was the old kind, slightly yellow, the bulb Leonard had never got around to replacing. She hadn't replaced it either. She worked through the numbers with a pencil. Savings, monthly costs, Patricia's retainer, the rough estimate of what a contested probate proceeding might run if it went the full distance. She wrote each figure down and looked at it. She crossed out the ones she couldn't control and circled the ones she could. If she lost the main estate, she would have the dome and 5 acres on Old Forge Road. That was the floor. That was what couldn't be taken. She looked out the window toward the dark where the dome was, though she couldn't see anything from here except the shapes of the trees against the sky. Then Patricia called again. Late. After 9, which meant it wasn't a routine call. The expert Cole had retained had reviewed Leonard's medical records. A neuropsychiatrist out of Missoula. His opinion, Parkinson's disease at stage 2 could affect executive decision-making and legal cognition in some patients. Not would. Not did. Could. That word is doing a lot of work, Margot said. It's doing exactly the work Cole needs it to do, Patricia said. We need Leonard's treating physician, his actual neurologist, someone who saw him regularly and can speak to his specific cognitive state when he signed the will. Dr. Hewson. Yes. He retired. He moved out of state. A silence on Patricia's end that lasted long enough to mean she already knew. I know, she said. We need to find him anyway. Margot said she understood. She said goodnight. She set the phone down on the table beside the legal pad. The welding gloves were still on the nail by the kitchen door. The left one slightly more worn than the right, the way it always was, because Leonard's left hand was the one that gripped. She had walked past those gloves every day for 4 years and never once thought to move them. She didn't move them now. She drove out to Old Forge Road without deciding to. It was past 10, full dark, the headlights picking up the grass on either side of the track as she turned off the county road. She didn't go all the way to the dome. She stopped at the point where the road curved and the structure would have to come into view in daylight, and she turned off the engine. The dark outside was complete. No moon yet. Just the sound of the wind moving through the grass, and somewhere further off, the creek she could hear but not see. She sat with both hands on the wheel. She didn't think about Cole or the filing or the neuropsychiatrist from Missoula. She didn't think about anything with edges or names. She just sat in the dark with the weight of all of it pressing down at once, and she let it press. 10 minutes. Maybe more. Then she started the engine and drove home. Saturday morning, she went alone. Delia had offered. Margot had said no, and Delia, who understood some things without being told, had not offered again. The drive out to Old Forge Road felt different in daylight. The grass on either side of the track was dry and pale, the color of the hills in late October, and the mountains to the north were sharp against a sky that had gone the particular blue it only reached when the cold was coming in for good. Margot drove slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't sure what she was going toward, only that she needed to go toward it without anyone watching. She unlocked the doors and pulled them open and stood for a moment in the entrance, letting her eyes adjust. The light came through the roof in thin, angled lines, 6 places where the corrugated steel had lifted or cracked over the years, letting in narrow columns of dusty light that crossed the floor at low angles. The space was larger inside than it looked from the road, maybe 40 feet long, 25 wide, the ceiling arching up to a peak 12 feet overhead. The floor was poured concrete, cracked in a few places, but solid. The walls, where the light reached them, showed the dark orange of old rust against the gray of the metal. The smell was damp steel and machine oil, and underneath both of those, something dry and faint, sawdust maybe, or old timber. The kind of smell that belonged to a place where work had happened for a long time. Along both walls ran steel shelving, empty. In the far right corner, a welding rig sat under a canvas tarp, the edges of the tarp stiff with dust. And in the far left corner, set against the wall at a slight angle as if it had been placed with some thought about the light, a workbench. Heavy wood, thick top, the kind built to take weight without complaint. The surface was clean. Everything else in the dome had the look of long disuse. The bench looked like someone had wiped it down before leaving. Margot walked to it. She stood in front of it and placed both hands flat on the surface the way Leonard used to do when he was reading a plan or working out a measurement. She hadn't decided to do that. It was just what you did when you stood at a workbench like this. The wood was cold under her palms, solid, not a movement in it. The drawer below the bench was wide and deep, running almost the full length of the top. A simple wooden toggle held it shut. No lock, just the toggle and the weight of what was inside. She lifted the toggle and pulled. 7 rolls of paper, each one bound with a length of brown twine, each one standing upright in the drawer in order, not stacked, standing. The way you'd store them if you wanted to find a specific one without disturbing the rest. She lifted the first roll out and set it on the bench, untied the twine and spread it flat, using her forearms to hold the edges down. It was a floor plan, precise, hand-drawn in pencil, every line ruled straight, dimensions noted in Leonard's small, careful handwriting at regular intervals. She recognized the footprint immediately. The dome shape, the curve of the walls, the position of the main doors. But the interior was nothing like what she was standing in. The space had been divided and organized. A welding area along the right wall with ventilation noted, a teaching area down the center with a row of smaller workbenches marked in, a storage section near the back, and at the far end, a small enclosed room labeled in Leonard's hand, office/rest area. She stood very still and read it again. The second roll, an equipment list. Welder, grinder, drill press, workbench specifications, storage units. Beside each item, a cost estimate and a supplier name. 3 of the suppliers were local, 2 in Billings, 1 she didn't recognize. The estimates were current, not old prices. The third roll, a construction schedule, broken into months, demolition and prep, electrical rough-in, framing, equipment installation, final fit-out. The projected start date was April. She set the roll down on the bench. Leonard had died in March. She picked up the first roll again, the floor plan, and this time she looked at the bottom right corner. Every technical drawing had one. A title block, a date, a signature. Leonard A. Dean. The date below his name, November 14th. 2 years before he died. She did the calculation without meaning to, the way you do when numbers mean something. 2 years before he died. 18 months before the Parkinson's diagnosis. He had drawn this when his hands were still steady, when there was no tremor yet, when there was no particular reason to think about what would happen to her after. He had started drawing this place 2 years before he knew he was sick. She read the date again. She looked at his signature, the same compressed, economical hand she'd seen in the notebook in his truck, in the margins of the maintenance logs he kept for his equipment, in the single word he'd said at the kitchen table one evening years ago when she'd asked him if he had regrets. Same hand, different year, same answer. She rolled the 3 drawings back carefully and tied them with the twine. The 4 remaining rolls she left standing where Leonard had put them. She wasn't ready for more. Not today. She replaced the 3 in the drawer in the same order she'd found them and pressed the wooden toggle back into place. Then she pulled the chair out from behind the bench, a plain wood chair, the kind you didn't notice until you needed to sit down, and she sat. The wind outside moved against the dome, and the steel gave a low sound, not quite a creak, more like a settling. The light columns had shifted slightly as the morning moved. Dust turned slowly in the air above the bench. She didn't cry right away. It came slowly, the way things do when they've been held a long time, not with any particular sound, just her hands in her lap, and her eyes not focused on anything, and the quiet of the dome around her. Nobody was watching. She didn't need anyone to be. Outside, the wind moved through the grass the way it always did in October. Inside, Margot sat in Leonard's chair and did not move for a long time. Patricia had tried the official channels. Margot tried the ones she knew. Nursing stations, patient intake offices, the small clinics that picked up retired doctors for part-time work. 15 years in community health had taught her one thing. Doctors who retired didn't disappear. They just moved sideways into the system somewhere else. She started Monday morning with a legal pad and the phone on the kitchen table. She wrote the name at the top, Dr. R. Hewson, Neurology. Below it, a column for clinic names, a column for phone numbers, a column for notes. She worked outward from the county. The nearest regional hospital first, then the smaller clinics, then the rehabilitation centers, then the specialist networks that sometimes picked up retired physicians for part-time consulting work. She grasped something from 15 years of community nursing. Doctors who retired rarely disappeared entirely. They consulted. They covered shifts. They stayed connected to the system in some form because the system was what they knew. She made 11 calls the first day. Nothing. 9 the second. A receptionist in Butte thought she remembered a Dr. Hewson, but the name in the system was different. A dead end. On the third day, on the 14th call, a scheduling coordinator at a small family clinic in Idaho Falls paused when Margot gave the name. Dr. Hewson does consult with us, she said. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Can I ask what this is regarding? Margot explained, briefly and exactly, the way she used to brief attending physicians. Relevant facts. No padding. The coordinator took her number. Hewson called back within the hour. He remembered Leonard without hesitation. Stubborn man, he said. Not unkindly, more like a doctor describing a patient he'd found genuinely interesting. Wouldn't take the medication until I explained why 3 times. Once wasn't enough. Twice he'd listen but not commit. Third time, if I got the reasoning right, he'd nod and do it. Margot held the phone and said nothing for a moment. That was Leonard exactly. Not resistance for its own sake, just the need to understand something before he agreed to it. She told Hewson what Cole had filed, what the retained expert had claimed. The word could. Hewson was quiet for a few seconds. I documented every appointment, he said. Cognitive assessments, medication response, functional evaluations. His neurological presentation was consistent, and his decision-making capacity was fully intact throughout our time together, including the period when he signed the new will. A pause. Stage 2 Parkinson's affects motor function. It does not, in Leonard's case or in the majority of Stage 2 cases, impair executive cognition. I'll put all of that in writing. Thank you, Margot said. Don't thank me, Hewson said. Just send me the dates you need covered. Patricia called that evening after she'd received Hewson's preliminary statement by email. This changes things. She let that sit for a moment, then continued. Cole's second claim, the equipment. I should have led with this earlier and I didn't, so I'm telling you now. Leonard's will has a residuary clause. Everything not specifically named goes to you. The welding tools, the machinery, all of it. Cole's attorney knows this. She paused. That claim was always a pressure tactic, not a real legal argument. He was testing how much you knew. Margot thought about the settlement envelope, still on her kitchen table, still unopened, because she hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Cole had walked into her house 3 days after her husband's funeral and offered her comfort and a number. He had been counting on her not knowing what she actually had. All right, she said. There's still a timing problem, Patricia said. Even with Hewson, Cole can run delays, procedural motions, continuances, requests for additional evaluation. We can win this, Margot, but winning slowly might cost you almost as much as losing. The legal fees alone. Is there anything in the dome, Margot said, that could end this faster? Patricia stopped. That depends on what's in it, she said. Neither of them spoke after that. They both knew Margot hadn't looked through everything yet. The town was shifting, one person at a time. Ed Garrity stopped her outside the hardware store. He hadn't met her eyes in 2 weeks. Now he did. "Leonard built good," he said. "Whatever's in there will hold." Not an apology. The closest he could get to one. That evening, Delia came by with coffee. "People around here don't switch sides fast," she said. "But they switch." Margot wrapped both hands around her mug. Outside, the wind had come up again, rattling the storm window on the north side of the house. The one Leonard had meant to reseal before winter and hadn't gotten to. She thought about 7 rolls of paper standing upright in a drawer, tied with brown twine, waiting in the order he'd left them. She thought about what might still be in that dome. The second time Margot went into the dome, she brought a flashlight, work gloves, and the deliberate calm of someone who had spent 15 years not missing things. She had learned early in her nursing career that systematic was different from thorough. Systematic meant following a procedure. Thorough meant not leaving until you were certain. She had known nurses who were one without the other, and she had seen what that cost. She had always tried to be both. She started at the left wall and worked clockwise. Every shelf, every bracket, every place where something might have been set down and forgotten. The welding rig in the corner. She lifted the canvas tarp and checked underneath. Old equipment, well-maintained, nothing hidden among it. The concrete floor showed no seams or irregularities that suggested anything below. She came back to the workbench last. She had already opened the main drawer once, the wide one with the 7 rolls of paper. But she stood in front of the bench now and looked at it the way she used to look at a patient chart when she had the feeling she'd read it too fast the first time. The bench was built heavy and solid, the kind of construction that didn't leave space unused. She crouched and looked at the underside. There it was. Set back, flush with the frame, a second drawer, shallower than a hand's width, no handle. The kind of thing you wouldn't find unless you were looking at the underside of the bench in the right light at the right angle. She got her fingers into the gap at the front edge and pulled. Inside, 1 envelope. Brown paper, the kind used for documents. A name written on the front in pencil, in Leonard's compressed, careful hand. Cole. Just that. His son's name, in pencil. Margot stayed crouched for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of the drawer, the envelope sitting where Leonard had put it. Then she stood, picked it up, and carried it outside into the light. She drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. She didn't look at it while she drove. When she got home, she set it on the kitchen table, on the side of the table where nobody usually sat. And she started dinner. She made soup, the kind that took time, that required attention at intervals, that gave her hands something to do while her mind worked. She stirred when it needed stirring. She washed the cutting board. She put the bread in. The envelope sat on the other side of the table, and she was aware of it the entire time, the way you're aware of something without looking directly at it. This was a letter Leonard had written for Cole, not for her. Whatever was in it belonged to his son, who had grown up without enough of his father and had come back now in the worst possible way because he didn't know any other way to come back. She had no right to open it. She also understood that it might change everything. She called Patricia at 7:30, after the soup was done and the kitchen was clean. "I found something," she said. "A letter. It's addressed to Cole." A short silence. "Don't open it yet," Patricia said. "Bring it to me tomorrow." Patricia's office the next morning was quiet. The first snow of November had started overnight, thin, not sure yet if it meant to stay. The light through the window was flat and even. Patricia put on document gloves, opened the envelope at the top, and extracted a single folded page. She read it without expression. When she finished, she read it again. Then she passed it to Margot. Leonard had written it in his usual hand, small, straight. Each letter formed with the same precision he brought to measurements and technical notes. One page. The lines were spaced evenly, as if he'd thought about how much room he had and used it accordingly. Nothing crossed out. He wrote to Cole the way he'd built things, without excess, without ornament, each sentence carrying its own weight. He said he knew. He hadn't been there enough when Cole was young. Not an apology, an acknowledgement, stated plainly, the way a man who doesn't make excuses admits a thing that's true. He said the marriage ending hadn't been Cole's fault, and hadn't been Cole's mother's fault, in the way Cole probably believed. He said he had loved Cole's mother genuinely, and that love ending was one of the things in his life he still didn't entirely understand. He did not apologize for Margot. He wrote, "She did not take anything from you, Cole. I gave it. There is a difference, and I need you to sit with that difference for a while." And then, at the bottom of the page, in the same even hand, "I hope someday you understand the difference between what a man owes and what a man gives freely." That was all. Margot set the letter down on the desk. He had written it for Cole. But she was the one who finally understood what Leonard had been trying to say for 12 years. Not just to his son, but to her. To anyone who had ever watched him and wondered if the silence meant absence. It didn't. It never had. Patricia let the quiet sit for a moment before she spoke. "As evidence of cognitive capacity, this letter is significant," she said. "The clarity of reasoning, the structure of the argument, it directly contradicts the expert claim that Leonard's judgment was impaired. His attorney knows we have Hewson. If he sees this too—" "It's not a weapon," Margot said. Patricia looked at her. "He didn't write it to win a case," Margot said. "He wrote it because he's a father who ran out of time." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do with it?" Margot looked at the letter on the desk, at the penciled name on the envelope, at the snow coming down outside the window, slow and thin, settling on the sill without any sound at all. "I'll give it to him," she said. "After." Outside Patricia's window, the first snow of November was coming down slow and thin. Neither woman moved to comment on it. The hearing was in the morning. Margot sat at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night, with the full case file in front of her. Hewson's statement, Patricia's motion, the property transfer documentation, the will itself. She had read through all of it twice already. She was reading it again not because she expected to find something new, but because she was the kind of person who needed to know she hadn't missed anything before she stopped looking. The envelope with Cole's letter sat to her right, apart from the rest. She had brought it home from Patricia's office in her boom and set it there when she got in, and it had stayed there through dinner and through the dishes and through the first hour of reading. She looked at it now. Patricia had been careful about how she'd said it. As evidence of cognitive capacity, the letter is significant. She hadn't pushed. She had laid out what it could do and left the decision where it belonged. But Margot understood the arithmetic. Hewson's statement was strong. The letter, added to it, would make the case close to airtight. A judge looking at that letter, the clarity of its reasoning, the precision of its language, one page written by a man with Parkinson's who knew exactly what he wanted to say and said it, would have very little room to find in Cole's favor. Leonard had not written that letter to win a court case. She knew that. She had known it the moment she read it. She left the envelope where it was and closed the case file. She drove out to Old Forge Road at 11 o'clock at night. She stood at the dome doors with the flashlight in her hand and didn't turn it on. The cold had come in properly now, the kind that settled into the ground and didn't lift until April, the kind that made Montana feel like it was stating something about itself. Her breath showed in the air. Around her the grass was stiff and pale in the dark, and the mountains were somewhere out there behind the clouds, invisible but present the way they always were. She stood at the door and held the flashlight and didn't move. No one knew she was here. Patricia hadn't asked her to come. Delia didn't know. She had driven out on the feeling that Leonard, who had never done anything without a reason, had not finished yet. And now, standing in the dark at the entrance to a building she had opened twice already, she wasn't certain that feeling was anything more than a widow who didn't want to let go. Maybe the dome had given her everything it had. Maybe there was nothing left to find. She stood there long enough to consider that seriously. Long enough that the cold worked through her coat and into her shoulders. Then she turned on the flashlight and went in. She went straight to the workbench. Not to the hidden drawer. She'd been through that. She checked the underside once more. Nothing else there. She opened the main drawer. 4 rolls still tied with twine, the ones she'd left on Saturday. She went through them one by one. The electrical diagram, the material specifications, the site timeline, and the last one. She lifted it out and set it on the bench. When she untied the twine and unrolled it, something fell out from inside the coil. A single sheet of paper, folded in quarters, the way you fold something you want to keep flat but protected. It landed on the bench without a sound, a name on the outside, in pencil. Margot. She opened it standing at the bench, with the flashlight wedged under her arm to keep both hands free. 1 page. Leonard's handwriting, but smaller than usual. The letters placed more carefully than his normal working hand. The way his writing looked when he was taking time with something. He wrote about the clinic. The Tuesday in late March, the metal fragment, the way she had cleaned the wound and put in 7 stitches without comment and without fuss. He wrote, "You never asked why I came back. I came back because I didn't know how to say thank you any other way." She read that once and then kept reading. The letter was short. He hadn't used more words than he needed, which was the only way he knew how to write, the only way he knew how to do most things. He wrote about 12 years the way he might describe a structure he'd built, not with sentiment, but with the knowledge of what had gone into it, and what it had cost, and what it had held. And at the bottom of the page, the last line, "I never said it enough. I'm saying it now." She read it again. "I never said it enough. I'm saying it now." And once more, slowly, in the cold and the dark, with the flashlight throwing long shadows across the curved steel walls. "I never said it enough." She set the page down on the bench and stood there with her hand resting on the edge of the wood. The wind outside moved against the dome. The metal answered it the way it always did. Not giving, just holding. She thought about the notebook in the truck, the dried flowers on the windowsill, the chair on the porch that had held through 12 winters, the "no" he had said at the kitchen table when she asked him if he had regrets. The blueprint signed November 14th, 2 years before he knew he was sick. All of it the same answer. All of it this. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest, and stood in the dark dome for another few minutes before she was ready to go back out into the cold. She sat in the truck outside for a moment before starting the engine. The envelope with Cole's letter was on the passenger seat. She'd brought it with her without deciding to, the same way she'd driven out here without deciding to. She looked at it. She had enough to win without it. Patricia had Hewson. Hewson had documentation. The case was as strong as it was going to get. And Leonard had given her exactly that. Enough. Not more than she needed. Not a guarantee. Just enough to stand on. She would give Cole his letter after the hearing, whatever the outcome. She started the engine. She had enough to win without it. And Leonard had given her exactly that. Enough. The hearing room was smaller than Margot expected. She had imagined something heavier, more wood, more ceremony. Instead, it was just a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, and a judge who looked like she had seen this before. Judge Eleanor Marsh was 61, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to people explain themselves. She sat behind a standard government-issue desk, not a bench, and she had a yellow legal pad in front of her that she hadn't written anything on yet. Cole was already seated when Margot came in. Dark suit, same as the first time. He didn't look up. Patricia had told her the night before to let the documentation speak. You don't need to say anything unless the judge addresses you directly. Hewson's statement is clear. Our position is clear. The less we embellish, the better. Before the hearing began, Patricia leaned close and said quietly, "One more thing. I had Leonard's handwriting independently verified before today. Signature comparison against the will and 3 bank documents. If Cole's attorney raises authentication on the letter, we're covered." She set a single page in her folder and closed it. We're covered on everything. Cole's attorney presented the incapacity argument in measured, careful language. Stage 2, Parkinson's. The diagnosis timeline. The expert's assessment, could have affected, delivered as if the possibility alone was sufficient. He was competent, and he knew his brief, and the brief was thin, and he knew that, too. Patricia responded with Hewson's statement. She read the relevant sections directly into the record, the dates of each appointment, the specific cognitive assessments, the clinical language that left almost no room for interpretation. Dr. Hewson had treated Leonard Dean for 14 months. He had documented every visit. His professional opinion, stated in writing and available for cross-examination, was unambiguous. Judge Marsh read through the Hewson statement herself. She took her time. The room was quiet, except for the fluorescent light above the door that had a slight flicker to it, the kind you stopped noticing after a minute. 2 minutes passed, maybe a little more. The judge set the papers down and looked at Cole's attorney over the top of her reading glasses. "Counselor," she said, "your expert says may have affected. Dr. Hewson, who treated this man for 14 months, says did not. Those are not equivalent statements." She paused. Who knew Leonard Dean better? Cole's attorney started to respond. The judge waited. The response didn't quite arrive. Cole, beside him, said nothing. That was the answer. The recess lasted 20 minutes. Patricia came to find Margot in the hallway, where she had been sitting on a wooden bench against the wall, with her coat folded in her lap. "Cole's attorney wants to talk," Patricia said. "All right," Margot said. She waited on the bench. Down the hall, through a glass partition, she could see Patricia and Cole's attorney standing near a window. She couldn't hear them. She watched the way the 2 lawyers moved, the small adjustments of posture that meant something was being agreed to, the particular moment when one side stopped talking and started listening. 15 minutes. Patricia came back alone. "He's withdrawing," she said. Margot looked at her. "All claims," Patricia said. "The will stands. The estate proceeds as written." The hallway was quiet. Someone walked past carrying a box of files, not looking at either of them. From somewhere further along the corridor came the sound of a door closing. Margot nodded once. She didn't smile. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Patricia put her hand briefly on Margot's arm, then took it away. "Let's get the paperwork filed." Cole came out of the conference room 10 minutes later, his attorney beside him, coat over his arm. He was moving toward the exit. He didn't look toward the bench where Margot was still sitting. She stood. "Cole." He stopped, turned slowly. She crossed the hallway to him and reached into her bag and took out the brown envelope, the one she had carried from the dome to the kitchen table, to the truck, to Patricia's office and back again. The one with his name written on it in Leonard's pencil. She held it out. "Your father wrote this," she said. "It belongs to you." Cole looked at the envelope, at the penciled letters of his own name. Something shifted in his face. Not much. Not in any way she could have described precisely. Just the small movement of a man who had been holding his expression in place for a long time and had stopped, for a moment, holding it. He reached out and took the envelope, with both hands. He took it with both hands. She noticed that. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. She turned and walked back toward the door. She didn't watch to see if he opened it. She put on her coat and walked out into the November cold, and that was enough. She did not celebrate. There was nothing wrong with celebrating, but it wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was to get back to Old Forge Road and start. She called Roy Briggs that same afternoon, from the courthouse parking lot, still in her coat. She had his number from Ed Garrity, who had mentioned him twice in the weeks before the hearing. Once when she asked about contractors, once when she didn't. Roy was 58, had been building and repairing things in this county since before Margot arrived, and had known Leonard long enough to have fixed his equipment and borrowed his welding rig on at least 2 occasions that Ed could recall. Roy came out to the dome 2 days later. He walked around the outside first, the way Leonard used to walk around any structure before he touched it, looking at what was there before deciding what to do with it. Then he came inside. Margot had the 7 rolls of paper spread on the workbench. She had weighted the corners with tools from the shelf and walked Roy through each one in the order Leonard had intended. Floor plan first, then electrical, then framing, then equipment placement, then the timeline. Roy stood at the bench and read through the floor plan without saying anything. He moved to the second drawing, then the third. He was the kind of man who needed to understand a thing fully before he spoke about it, which was a quality Margot had come to recognize and appreciate. He looked at the signature block on the floor plan. The name, the date. He drew this himself? Yes, Margot said. Roy was quiet for another moment. He put his hand flat on the bench, the same surface, and looked at the drawings again. All right, he said. Let's build it right. The work began the following Monday. Roy brought 2 men with him, quiet, competent, the kind of crew that showed up on time and didn't need to be told the same thing twice. They started with the roof, the way Leonard's notes specified. Reinforce before anything else. The corrugated panels that had lifted were reseated and secured. New sealant along the ridge. The crack that had let in columns of dusty light, The same light Margot had stood in the first morning she came inside alone, was closed. The dome went dark for a day while they worked on the roof. Then the new lighting went in, industrial strips along the curve of the ceiling, and the space changed entirely. It stopped looking abandoned. It started looking like somewhere. The community arrived the way it always did in small Montana towns, without announcement, one person at a time, each one making a small gesture that didn't require acknowledgement. Ed Garrity handed Margot a different invoice than the one she'd expected when she came in for supplies the second week. She looked at it, then at him. He had already turned back to the shelving. On the third Saturday, the minister's wife appeared at the dome with a covered dish and set it on the tailgate of Roy's truck without ceremony and drove away. An older farmer named Walt Greer, whose equipment Leonard had serviced for years, arrived one morning with his tractor and spent a day grading and clearing the ground around the building without being asked. When Margot came out to thank him, he waved her off and kept working. Delia watched all of this from the edge of the cleared lot one afternoon, coffee in hand, and said, "You know what this is? This is people saying sorry without the word." Margot looked at Roy's crew along the far wall, at Walt's tractor tracks in the turned earth. She thought of Leonard, the apples, the notebook in the truck. "I know," she said. The week after the hearing, she had put Cole's settlement envelope, still sealed, the way he'd left it on her table, into a fresh envelope and mailed it back to his attorney's office in Billings. No letter inside. No explanation. Just the envelope, returned. It was a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks into the work, when Roy appeared at the dome entrance where Margot was measuring clearance for the equipment. "There's a car parked at the end of the road," he said. "Been there about an hour." Margot set down the measuring tape and looked out through the open doors. Dark gray. Rental plates. The engine was running. She could see the faint movement of exhaust in the cold air. Coal. She looked at the car for a moment. Then she picked up the measuring tape and went back to work. From where she stood, she could see the car without appearing to watch it. The windows were up. Nobody got out. Then the phone on the passenger seat lit up. She was too far away to see the name on the screen, but she saw Cole look down at it, saw his hand stay on the wheel. The screen went dark. A minute passed, maybe 2, and it lit up again. Same or different, she couldn't tell. He looked at it again. His hand didn't move. The screen went dark and stayed dark. Cole sat there, with both hands on the wheel, and the engine running, and the exhaust curling up in the November air. And Margot finished her measurements and moved on to the next section of wall. She didn't go out. She went back to work. 15 minutes later, when she glanced through the open doors again, the road was empty. She never mentioned it to anyone. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. They finished the roof first, the way Leonard's drawings specified, reinforced before anything else. Roy had read the notes 3 times and said the man knew what he was doing. The work took 3 months in total, which was longer than the original timeline Leonard had drawn up and shorter than Roy had initially estimated. The difference, Roy said, was that Leonard's measurements were exact. There was no guesswork in the drawings, no approximations that needed adjusting in the field. Every dimension held. Roy had been building things for 30 years, and he said that mattered more than most people understood. The corrugated panels that had lifted were secured and coated, not replaced, because the steel underneath was still sound, and Leonard's notes had said repair first, replace only what can't be saved. The roof went on, the gaps sealed, and by the second week in December, The dome held heat for the first time in years. The concrete floor was ground and polished. The industrial lighting went in along the curve of the ceiling. 8 fixtures, evenly spaced, throwing clean, even light across the whole space. The ventilation system for the welding area was installed last, the ducting running up through a new penetration in the roof that Roy sealed himself and guaranteed against weather. Roy built the workbenches to Leonard's measurements. 3 of them, not 2. Room for more than 1, his drawings had said, and Roy added a 3rd on his own judgment, without charging for the extra materials. He said nothing about it. Margot noticed and said nothing either. The tools went up on the wall in the order Margot had decided. The wrenches by size, the clamps grouped by type, the measuring equipment on the highest rack where it wouldn't get knocked. She hung Leonard's hammer last, on a hook near the entrance, where the light from the doorway would catch it first thing in the morning. Outside, above the main doors, Roy's crew mounted a small steel sign. Black letters, simple typeface, no flourishes. Dean Forge, not her name. His name, kept in the place he had built for her. Lacey Briggs came on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks before the forge was scheduled to open. Margot heard the knock and found her standing in the doorway. 17 years old, tall, hair pulled back, wearing a flannel shirt that was clearly her father's, the cuffs turned up twice to fit. She had Roy's jaw and her own eyes and the particular stillness of a person who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now committed to saying it. "Dad said you might take on apprentices," she said. Margot looked at her for a moment. "You know anything about metalwork?" "No," Lacey said, "but I learned fast." "You tried somewhere before this?" A pause, the kind that came from deciding whether to answer honestly. "The Whitfield shop over in Denton. They said it wasn't the right fit." Margot understood what that meant. She had heard that sentence before, in different rooms, about different things. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Monday," she said. 7 o'clock. Don't be late." Lacey nodded once. She didn't smile, didn't say thank you, just nodded, the way someone nods when they mean it. Then she turned and walked back to her truck. Margot watched her go. Roy's truck was parked at the end of the road, engine idling. He hadn't come in. He'd sent his daughter and waited at a distance, which was exactly the kind of thing Leonard would have done. The evening before the forge opened, Margot went in alone. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. The last of the day came through the open doors, low and pale, the way December light in Montana came in at an angle and didn't stay long. It caught the edges of the tools on the wall, the surface of the workbenches, the sign Roy had mounted above the entrance when viewed from inside. She walked the length of the space slowly, the way you walk through something you want to remember before it changes. At the main workbench, she stopped. She stood in front of it and put her hand flat on the surface. The thick wood top Roy had built to Leonard's measurements, the same measurements Leonard had written down 2 years before he knew he was sick. The surface was solid. Didn't give it all. She held her hand there for a moment, in the quiet and the fading light, and then she was ready. Lacey Briggs arrived at 6:58. She stood outside the door for 2 minutes before Margot opened it from the inside. Margot had been there since 6:30. She had made coffee on the small camp stove Roy's crew had left behind and stood at the workbench with it and gone through Leonard's floor plan one more time. Not because she needed to, but because it was Monday, and this was how Monday began now. She heard footsteps on the gravel outside and waited. When she opened the door, Lacey was standing straight, hands at her sides, breath showing in the cold air. Margot stepped back without a word. Lacey came in. She stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the space the way you look at something you've been thinking about for a while and are finally seeing. The workbenches, the tools on the wall in their order, the ventilation ductwork running clean along the ceiling. The lighting, even and bright. The floor, which still smelled faintly of the compound Roy had used to seal it. Her eyes moved along the wall and stopped. Leonard's hammer. Black iron head. Hickory handle worn smooth where his hand had gripped it through years of use. It hung on the hook near the entrance, where the morning light from the doorway reached it first. Lacey looked at it for a moment. She didn't ask about it. She looked at Margot and then back at the rest of the forge and waited. Margot didn't start with theory. She never had. Not in the clinic, not anywhere. You started with what a person could hold in their hands. She picked up a short length of flat steel stock from the rack, set it on the anvil, and showed Lacey how to stand. Weight back on the heels, not the toes, shoulders loose. The strike came from the whole body, not just the arm. If you used only the arm, you'd tire fast and your aim would drift. She demonstrated once. The ring of it went up into the dome and came back down. The metal tells you when it's ready, she said. You don't force it. You wait for it. Lacey nodded. Not the nod of someone being polite. The nod of someone filing something away. They worked through the morning. Margot showed her how to read the surface of the metal, how heat changed what it would accept, how the same force applied at slightly different angles produced entirely different results. Lacey asked questions when she had them, and was quiet when she didn't. She made mistakes and corrected them without being told twice. At some point, Margot couldn't have said exactly when, she stepped back. Lacey was at the anvil with Leonard's hammer in her hands. Margot had taken it down from the wall and passed it to her the way you pass any tool. Here, try this one. Lacey didn't know whose it had been. She only knew that it was heavier than the practice hammer and balanced differently, the weight distributed further toward the head, and that when she held it correctly, it felt like it had been made to be held that way. She raised it, found her position, brought it down. Steel on steel. The sound went up into the curve of the dome, full and clean, the kind of sound that meant the strike had landed true, and the dome held it for a moment, the way it held everything, before it faded into the cold morning air. Margot said nothing. She did not tell Lacey it was a good strike, though it was. She did not tell her whose hammer it was, or what had happened in this building over the past year, or what it had cost to get to this Monday morning. She looked at Lacey standing at the anvil with the hammer still in her hand, steady, waiting to see what came next, and she nodded. Once, small and exact, the way Leonard used to. Outside, the Montana sky was the pale blue of early winter, the mountains clear and sharp against it the way they only got when the cold had fully arrived. The sign above the door caught the morning light. Dean Forge, black letters on steel, simple and permanent. Inside, the forge was warm and the anvil was ringing, and a 17-year-old girl was learning what it meant to let the metal tell you when it was ready. The dome held the sound for a moment before it faded. Inside, something had just begun. If someone in your life showed love by doing rather than saying, a parent, a spouse, someone who built things or fixed things or showed up quietly when it mattered, tell us about them in the comments. We read every one.